Alex Burton, and this is the Business File. And this is a hamburger. And this is red tape. Over 41,000 government regulations affected the making of this hamburger. Everything from where the cow grazed to the vitamins in the bun to how thick the pickle should be. Government and its regulations are a fact of life for anyone in business. They affect some more than others, but sooner or later, every operation, retail, wholesale, hardware, software, whatever, has to deal with them. Governmental agencies are part of the environment in which business must exist, and like other parts of that environment, unions, the economy, social pressures, they shape and influence how American business works. Today, we are going to take a look at government regulations, at some of the agencies that are responsible for regulations and the impact on business of regulation, and we'll be talking with representatives from 3 of the major agencies and see how they view their jobs. We'll also take a look at businesses' point of view, the people who have to respond to government regulations. And finally, we'll discuss alternatives to regulation and the prospect of deregulation. But before we go into the future, we need to be sure we understand the present. So here to help us do that is Professor Susan Tolchin. Dr. Tolchin is a professor of public administration at George Washington University and the author of 4 books on government, including Dismantling America, The Rush to Deregulate. Professor Tolchin, thank you for being with us today.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
Professor Tolchin, what's the purpose of government regulation? Why do regulatory agencies like OSHA and the FTC exist?
Regulatory agencies exist to protect the public and to protect business. Former Speaker of the House, Sam Rayburn, said, "We created the regulatory agencies to do what we don't have time to do." And the regulatory agencies write regulations to actually carry out the laws that Congress writes.
How are businesses and industries regulated?
Industries and businesses are very highly regulated in a variety of ways. They're regulated from the point of view of maintaining a safe workplace, government makes sure that industries don't dump toxic waste into the water, into the air. And there's been a whole spate of regulatory agencies created since 1970 that are specifically geared toward helping businesses to protect the public against the kinds of things that government really wasn't involved in before, such as worker safety, clean air, clean water, mine safety, and so on.
How does government regulation affect the overall business climate?
Government regulation affects the overall business climate by costing business a whole lot of money. And this is what caused the reaction against regulation that we saw begin to develop in the late 1970s. Cleaning up their workplace and cleaning up the air and the water around them has turned out to be very costly. As a matter of fact, the Dow Chemical Corporation estimated that they spend $147 million a year on complying with government regulatory agencies, mainly in the area of health, safety, and the environment.
Boy, that's a lot of money, isn't it? Has government regulation worked, at least in some areas?
Sure. Government regulation, particularly in the environmental area, has worked fairly well. I mean, there have been problems, but it's worked fairly well. The Great Lakes were beginning to look like the Dead Sea around 1970 when the Clean Air and Water Acts, around the early 1970s when the Clean Air and Water Acts were passed. And as a result of the efforts of the EPA and the implementation of the Clean Water Act, those bodies of water have been considerably cleaned up. We've also seen evidence in specific parts of the country of successes of the Clean Air Act as well. Lung disease, for example, in certain parts of Montana have gone down by almost 20% as a result of government activity in forcing the Anaconda Copper Company to clean up the air around them.
That's a very positive benefit. What about the costs, though? Not just the dollar figures, the tangibles, but the long-range intangible costs as well.
Some of the intangible costs are the building up of resentment on the part of the business community toward government. And in many of these instances, although government was very generous in extending compliance deadlines for business, in many of these instances, companies were hit with tremendous costs. They were hit suddenly, and they developed a certain amount of resentment toward government in this area of particularly what we call social regulation, regulations that protect everybody, as opposed to economic regulations which just protect specific businesses, such as airline regulation and so on, which were just geared to specific businesses. But when companies were given the mandate, for example, given orders really to clean up the air, to stop discriminating against certain races, minorities, religions, and so on. These are the affirmative action regulations. When companies were given specific orders to comply with government regulation, it was not only costly in terms of the capital expenditures, the equipment that they had to put into these companies, it was also very expensive in terms of the paperwork, particularly onerous for small businesses. And I think this resentment created a chorus of protests against the regulatory process, which reached a crescendo with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980, who was elected really with a mandate to, quote, get the government off the backs of the people, the government by this time being equated with the regulatory agencies.
Well, thank you, Professor Tolchin. So, resentment was business' reaction to growing regulation. A little later, I want to ask you how business can respond to government regulation. But first, we need to talk with some other people. EPA, OSHA, FDIC, FDA, FCC, we've all heard of these agencies, but sometimes a little hard to keep the initials straight, so we've prepared something to help sort them out. There are more than 50 regulatory agencies. We don't have time to explain them all, but here's a handful of the most important. FCC stands for Federal Communications Commission, which is responsible for granting licenses for TV and radio stations. Not to be confused with the ICC, which stands for Interstate Commerce Commission, which establishes truck and railroad rates. The SEC, on the other hand, is the Securities and Exchange Commission, which regulates public stock trading. FDIC is one we're all familiar with. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation insures the deposits of banks belonging to the Federal Reserve System. Don't get it mixed up with the FSQS, which is the Food Safety and Quality Service. It certifies the grade and quality of fresh fruits and vegetables, meats and poultry. The FAA is the Federal Aviation Administration, which oversees airlines and air traffic controllers. Change one letter and you've got the FDA, which is the Food and Drug Administration. It inspects and tests food and drug products before they go on the market. The DEA, however, is the Drug Enforcement Administration, which controls the legal distribution and sale of narcotics and tries to make sure that illegal ones never get to the market. And then there's the CPSC, which is the Consumer Product Safety Commission, and the EPA, which is the Environmental Protection Agency, and the NRC, which is the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and the NHTSA, which stands for National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. And that's all the time we've got. Well, now that we have a clearer picture of the major agencies and what they do, we're going to talk with representatives from three of the most important. From the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, we have James Troy, who is Director of Region 1 Programs. As a member of the Commission's top management team, Mr. Troy supervises EEOC's field office operations. On behalf of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, we have Barry White, who has served OSHA in a number of capacities. Presently, he is the director of the Safety Standards Program. And representing the Federal Trade Commission, we have James McCarty. Mr. McCarty is the associate director of the Bureau of Competition for the FTC. As part of his job, he reviews all proposed law enforcement initiatives involving corporate mergers and joint ventures. So you can see these gentlemen ought to know what they're talking about. So let's start with you, Mr. Troy. What is the purpose or purposes of the EEOC?
The purposes of this agency are those as stated in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That is to prohibit discrimination, or at least to enforce the federal laws that prohibit discrimination on several factors. Those factors be race, religion, national origin, sex, color, age, and since 1979, age and equal pay.
Mr. White, OSHA is a somewhat younger agency. Why was it created and what are its goals?
It's a feeling that had gone on for probably 10 or 15 years before the act was passed in 1970 that, simply put, is that a worker should have the opportunity to come home at the end of the day in the same physical condition he was when he arrived there. And that isn't the case. There are somewhere around 10 to 12,000 people who die at work each year. There are somewhere around 2 million injuries, ranging from almost death to a rather simple injury. And we estimate somewhere around 200,000 workers each year are exposed to some kind of a toxic chemical. So Congress became alarmed about this, and in 1970 passed the Occupational Safety and Health Act to attempt to do something about this problem. One of the things they found, interestingly enough, that in most states there were more state employees assigned to protecting wildlife, fish, plants even, than there were the workers in the state's industries.
Compared to these two agencies, the Federal Trade Commission has been around forever. Mr. McCarty, would you tell me why is there an FTC and what is it supposed to do?
I'd be glad to, Alex. The purposes of the FTC really, I think, can be placed into three general categories. When Congress founded the FTC in 1914, it really gave us first a mission of promoting competition, promoting a competitive, efficient economy by enforcing the antitrust laws. Second, it charged the Commission with protecting consumers from injury that might result from deceptive or fraudulent sales practices. So in those two respects, the Commission is a law enforcement agency. But Congress also gave the Commission a third duty, and that was to conduct scholarly, detailed studies and reports, and in that way to try and promote the objectives of the first two areas, the pro-competition area and the pro-consumer protection issue. And so we try and share those reports with others in the government who might find them useful.
Mr. Troy, what areas of the workplace does the EEOC affect?
All areas, Alex, that deal with employment. Most of our charges are based on hiring, discharge, promotion, recruiting, and any general terms and conditions of employment that may be involved in the supervisory day-to-day operation.
Mr. White, how has OSHA affected business?
I think we've made a major change in the way business looks at safety and health. I think before it was seen as something that happened. Hopefully, you didn't have too many accidents and injuries to keep your rates down, but it wasn't planned for. It wasn't seen as an integral part of the business. The person responsible for safety and health used to report to the personnel officer, and was a low-level job. After 10 years of OSHA, after increased workman's compensation costs, increased insurance rates, safety and health now has become a regular part of doing business. It's as much as marketing and production. Safety and health has become a separate part, an important part.
What about the Federal Trade Commission, Mr. McCarty? What areas has it affected most?
Alex, I think that the two biggest areas are the area of promoting competition through our merger policy and the area of preventing false and deceptive advertising. In the first area involving corporate mergers, by law since 1976, every large corporate merger or asset acquisition that is proposed must be filed in advance with the FTC and with the Department of Justice. Now, the purpose of this is to give us time to review the proposed transaction in advance to see whether it might substantially lessen competition and thereby violate the antitrust laws that the FTC enforces. On the advertising side, the Commission has a statutory standard in which we must make sure that advertisements are not deceptive and are not unfair to consumers. And every advertisement that you see in the economy is subject to those prohibitions. So it's a very wide-reaching statute.
All right, gentlemen, now we know what you're supposed to do and how you go about doing it. What about what you don't set out to do? Do your agencies have an impact beyond their official purpose? Mr. Troy.
Well, we believe that the best byproduct of what we do and what we have done is to effect some change in the policies as developed by those companies and businesses that affect their employees and their applicants for employment. We have seen recently companies that take the general EEO area, the things that they see come out of this whole area, and build it into their general management scheme of things. We obviously impact upon the time companies spend to respond to our requests when we're investigating cases. That's time that's normally spent doing their general business. We do not attempt to make them spend more time than we believe is necessary. But since we need a complete airing of facts surrounding an issue, then we do request them to spend time to develop the information that we will need in order to show both sides of a matter.
Mr. White, in your years with OSHA, have you seen any significant changes in the way companies look at worker health, worker safety?
Companies have gone beyond simply waiting for an OSHA inspector to show up in the plant and point out the problems, and they've established in almost any large, even medium-sized business, a corporate structure to handle the problems of safety and health. They've hired industrial hygienists to be concerned about health. They've hired safety engineers. They hold training meetings with their workers. They bring their insurance companies in to talk about safety and health. They get themselves involved in significant capital expenditures to improve the workplace. What they've found is that not only are they protecting their own workers, are they following a federal law, but they're also increasing productivity. They're cutting down on their workmen's compensation costs. They're dropping their insurance rates. We have estimates from business that for every dollar an employer invests in safety and health, he gets $3 back in increased productivity. So we think there's been established out there a structure that would go on even should OSHA disappear as a federal agency, and that was our goal.
Mr. McCarty, what impact has the Federal Trade Commission had on business? That is, what impact beyond its charter?
The Commission is an agency with very broad powers, and that is power to do good as well as power to do evil if it's misused. Throughout the Commission's history, there have been times when its actions have had unintended consequences. Consequences that sometimes were adverse and sometimes that harmed consumers. Let me give you an example, if I may. In the field of merger enforcement, the Commission in the past brought a number of challenges to corporate acquisitions. In the period of 1970 through 1977, for example, the Commission brought and completed litigation in 18 antitrust merger cases. In 8 of those cases, one of the reasons in which the Commission used to condemn the merger as unlawful was that the merger would produce efficiencies that would lower the costs of production, thereby making it more difficult for other firms to compete with the now more efficient merged firm. Well, we have since learned our lesson, and we have since learned that lower costs are not a bad thing, they are a good thing. They help consumers. And that efficiency should not be used as a reason for condemning mergers. Unfortunately, all too often in the past, it was used, and used incorrectly by the Commission and by the courts. And we are now trying to redirect our enforcement efforts so that we only challenge those mergers that harm consumers, not the ones that help them.
Thank you, Mr. McCarty, and Mr. Troy, and Mr. White. That's how government sees the regulatory process. Let's find out how business sees it, or at least how one businessman sees it. Here to tell us is Walt Heumann. Mr. Heumann is chairman of the executive committee, chief operating officer, and a director of the Hunt Oil Company. In other words, he runs the show. He is also CEO of Hunt Investment Corporation. His responsibilities include oil and gas operations, real estate development and insurance, agriculture and ranching interests. Mr. Heumann, which government agencies and regulations affect your business?
Because of our diverse business operation, we have a multiple of government rules and regulations that affect us, all the way from the Department of Energy and our energy activities, OSHA, EEOC, the Department of Interior, which rules and regulates offshore leasing. In our agribusiness area, it's the Department of Commerce, Department of Agriculture. In the insurance area, those are regulated by state insurance agencies, as well as federal taxation statutes and FTC, and Federal Trade Commission. For the real estate area is probably the least regulated. What they are bound by are local rules and regulations, zoning ordinances, and what have you. I would say that there's federal, state, county, and local rules and regulations that require us to be knowledgeable of them before we go forward with our various business plans.
So for you and your companies, coping with government regulations is almost a daily routine. How does that affect you? What are the tangible and intangible costs?
Well, the tangible costs are, first of all, it does increase our costs of doing business. We have paperwork, and one time we documented that. And just in the energy business alone, we filled one room with boxes of the various reports that we have to file on a monthly basis. In addition to that, it requires more manpower, more outside services. We have to get, say, different agencies or different independent auditors to come in and validate to the federal, state, or local governments what we say is correct. So it has a measurable direct cost impact. The other aspect is the intangible cost, the philosophical aspect, it causes us many times to pause and not think, how can we maximize this business opportunity? But our first knee-jerk reaction is, what rule, what regulation do we not know about that may entrap us?
So what should be done? What you've described here sounds like a tangle of restrictions that you regularly have to contend with. Does business have any alternatives?
Sure. One, obviously, is an environment of total regulation-free. But quite frankly, I think the business community bears part of the responsibility of having those regulations there in the first place. Let me give you a good example. We had a Chamber of Commerce board meeting here in Dallas a couple of years ago. And before the board meeting started, a number of the board members, myself, sat around decrying the federal government and its intrusion and rules and regulations that we were burdened with. The meeting started. We addressed a resolution, passed it without discussion. It was only after the board meeting was over that we realized what hypocrites we were, because that resolution that we passed without discussion was some group that came in and they wanted endorsement of a regulation that would help their particular local business. So we cannot act sort of as a dual standard. If we don't believe that regulation is helpful, and I basically don't, then we can't be selective and want those regulations that help us enforce, but those that we're not concerned about, we want to reject them. If I think we anticipate some of the problems to the consumer, to the environment, and voluntarily try to take steps to change or improve, even though it is a little more expensive on the front end, then I think there would be less need, and perhaps we can convince our lawmakers to not pass this labyrinth of rules and regulations. So what are some of the alternatives? One, we in business can act more responsibly and anticipate so that we spend a little more on the front end, and I guarantee you we'll spend a lot less on the tail end if we don't have rules and regulations. Secondly, we can work constructively as private citizens to look at those rules and regulations and perhaps voluntarily go to the government and say, look, let us try on a laissez-faire attitude and give us a try, sort of a sunset statute type thing for 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years. And if it doesn't work, then put it back in place. But at least it's a two-way, it's a partnership, basically, private and public sector.
Okay, Mr. Heumann, thanks very much.
Alex, it's been my pleasure, and come back again. Look forward to seeing you.
So we've looked at government and its regulations from both sides now, from the regulators and those they regulate. Let's go back to Dr. Tolchin for some perspective. Dr. Tolchin, how can business respond to government regulation? What are some of the alternatives?
Well, business has many strategies and alternatives open to it, and I must say they've used them all. Business has used the lobbying mechanisms available to them in Washington, and many industries have expanded their offices here in Washington and have found that it's been very successful in preventing certain regulations from appearing. The used car industry, for example, several years ago was successful in its lobbying efforts in going to the Hill to prevent the Federal Trade Commission from issuing a rule governing consumer protection in the used car industry. Business has also used litigation. They've gone to court to try to stop regulations. And they've also used self-regulation. Some industries have been very successful in self-regulating in order to avoid government regulation. The advertising industry is a very good example of that, although the advertising industry would like the Federal Trade Commission to keep up a certain amount of a regulatory presence in order to prevent the charlatans from entering the field and giving the good advertising agencies a bad name. The fourth strategy open to business is deregulation, and they've been very successful in many areas in going to the Congress and the White House and getting their industries deregulated.
What exactly is deregulation?
Well, Mr. Burton, deregulation is a return to the marketplace. The theory is that the marketplace can better control an industry than big government.
Okay, what's been the impact of deregulation?
The impact of deregulation has been tremendous. In the area of economic deregulation, the deregulating of the banking, airline, railroad, trucking, and telecommunications industries, which has been done by the Congress in cooperation with the President, the impact has just been mind-boggling. In some areas, the deregulation has been a success in helping certain industries attain larger profits. What is still unknown, the jury is still out in the area of the impact, the social impact of economic deregulation. For example, in the airline industry, we've had at least 3 major bankruptcies since airline deregulation. In the banking industry, the largest number of banks, we had the largest number of bank closures since 1941 last year, and the social impacts of economic deregulation are yet to be determined.
One last question. Are we going to see more and more industries deregulated in the future, or is this a trend that's peaked?
I think there will be more deregulation where the powers that be can get away with it. We are beginning to see a reaction in the Congress against banking deregulation, against airline deregulation, because many people in the Congress can't get home at prices that were as cheap before deregulation, and so on. So we're beginning to see some constituent pressure on the Congress in some of the more immediate areas of deregulation. Everybody goes to the bank. Not everybody uses airlines, but everybody has something to do with banks and telephones, and that's where you're beginning to see the heat applied on members of Congress, and there's been a move in the Congress to stop the rush to deregulate in some of these areas.
Dr. Tolchin, thank you very much for taking the time to be with us.
Thank you. It's been very enjoyable.
Government regulation is an inevitable part of the modern business world. The question is, how much regulation is necessary? At what point does it become over-regulation? As we've seen, there are alternatives, such as self-regulation or regulation by the marketplace. Of course, we'll always have rules and regulations, and we'll always have to cope with them. But maybe in the future, we'll have a little less red tape. I'm Alex Burton, and this has been The Business File.
The preceding program is part of a college credit course.